Hi people, this will be a pretty big video covering the Restoration Druid from the more numerical perspective. I obviously can't talk about what will work best in practice or what build will be the best for a particular fight, considering the Burning Crusade isn't out yet. But I can talk about how the different healing spells compare in a number of ways, such as healing per mana, healing per second, the optimal healing builds for a particular spell, and so on and so forth. What might be optimal depends on a lot of things, including the fight, the group or the raid composition, your gear, your skill, your preferred playstyle, the other healers, and how much players are going to stand in the fire. But regardless, if a certain build looks rather poor in theory, the chances of it actually working out in practice are rather low. And with these things said, I'm quite excited to start showing you what I found and what I make out of it. The big change to Restoration Druids and the Burning Crusade is the new Tree of Life shapeshifting form and the new healing spell Lifebloom. Besides that, a number of new talents have been added as well as old ones reworked. I've looked at 3 specific builds that I believe will be optimal for a particular playstyle. Tree of Life deserves some extra attention. It is in my opinion not obvious that you always want to get that talent, or at least use it. The biggest issue with Tree of Life is the limitation to which spells you can cast. As you probably won't be surprised to hear, you can't cast balance spells while in tree form. But you also can't cast Healing Touch, nor can you cast Remove Curse. But the tree also increases the healing received to your entire party by 25% of your total spirits, as well as reducing the cost of your healing over time spells by 20%. This includes Rejuvenation, Lifebloom, Regrowth, Swiftmend, and possibly Tranquility, and of course, it also includes Innervate, Nature Swiftness, and Rebirth. It is obviously very strong for healing over time spells, but as you will find out later, it's not necessarily the best depending on the fight and how you prefer to heal. First off, we're going to compare the 3 main spells: Rejuvenation, Healing Touch, and Regrowth. For these numbers, I'm assuming 1440 healing power, which is basically what the pre-raid best in slot healing gear will provide you with. I'm also using an optimized build for each spell. Also, I've assumed a 15% spell crit chance, excluding talents. The first thing you might notice is how Regrowth in Tree of Life almost is identical to Healing Touch in terms of healing per mana, meaning you will be just fine using it when healing dungeons in Tree of Life. You might also notice how it pulls ahead of Healing Touch when it comes to healing per second. Note that this is the potential maximum, so this is assuming you're spamming the spell and keeping the HOTS up on the maximum number of targets. And for Regrowth, you can have about 7 HOTS active, at least in theory. Meanwhile, Rejuvenation pulls ahead of Healing Touch. Remember the trade-off for HOTS compared to direct heals. You might think that HOTS lead to huge overhealing, but in my experience, the big downside is rather the fact that you will have a hard time topping people quickly. But I'll get back to this later on. You might also have noticed the Storm Rage name, and you probably guessed what that is. This is what you in theory can do if you switch out 8 pieces of TBC pre-bis gear to the full Storm Rage set to get the extra tick on Rejuvenation, increasing it from 4 to 5 ticks per spell. As you can see, Storm Rage and the TBC pre-bis is very close. It will become obsolete rather quick, Storm Rage that is, but it might actually be fully viable for a few weeks in the beginning of TBC, but that's mainly as a fun side note. When it comes to potential healing per second, the spells are surprisingly equal. Healing Touch and Rejuvenation follows each other closely, while the 2 versions of Regrowth pulls ahead. At rank 4, all spells in the different builds are basically equal. Anyway, it's time to start looking more in detail at each build. To start off, we're going to look into Rejuvenation Healing, which will really be Tree of Life healing. In this build, Rejuvenation will be the base heal, together with Lifebloom for heavy single target healing, and Regrowth for the occasional, smaller direct heal, as well as the possible Swiftmend. Now, Rejuvenation maxes out its coefficient already at rank 4, which is a pretty low rank. The best rank to use will be depending on the required healing and the amount of mana available, but I suspect you either use something like rank 5 or rank 13 in raids, and likely the same ranks in dungeons. A major change from Classic to the Burning Crusade is the possibility to have several rejuvenations on the same target. That's several rejuvenations as in several druids have one rejuvenation each. Meanwhile, the strongest one would override the weaker one in vanilla. Several will simply be active on the same target now, allowing you to go for more than one Tree of Life druid in a raid without heavily gimping the Rejuvenation Healing. Now, Rejuvenation is a heal over time spell, which might increase the chances of it doing overhealing. If one player takes damage and is topped off 2 seconds after you apply the hot, then obviously it will produce massive overhealing. However, the situation where only one player takes damage once is actually quite uncommon, especially when you aren't the only healer. Damage in raids will very often be either periodic and reoccurring, such as melee attacks or dots, or it will be AoE. The dream scenario for healing over time healing is constant AoE damage. Like the big cold dead dragon in Necerium with the aura, that's like perfect for a hot. It seems to me that often when people not used to playing with hots consider them, they imagine exactly that scenario where only one player takes damage once and then is topped off almost instantly by a direct heal from another healing. And yes, in that situation a hot is useless. But the thing is that such a situation basically doesn't exist in a raid, and when you're in a dungeon there is not gonna be anyone to top a player off and make your hot useless, well, except for yourself. Now, another reason why healing over time healing will work better in TBC, besides the new talents and the fact that druids won't override each other's healing over time spell, has got to do with the new raid size. Meanwhile, most raids in vanilla ran something like 12 healers, most raids in TBC will go for 5. 12 healers in a 40-man raid means that each healer, on average, had to care for 3.3 players. 5 players in a 25-man raid means that each healer now will have to care for 5 players on average, and this will likely decrease the risk of getting your heals sniped. But like mentioned before, Rejuvenation won't be the only heal deep Resto druids use in TBC. As for the spell itself, it has a very good mana efficiency as well as good healing when used on several targets. If you heal in a raid or a dungeon as deep Resto, this spell will likely make up the bulk of your healing. And honestly, in TBC, Restoration Healing should be considered the meta healing for druids. Also, because you will just spam it every global cooldown, especially in raids, trinkets with a proc on cast chance are particularly good, as you will have a very high uptime on the proc. Lifebloom is actually a spell I feel kind of foreign to. It's an interesting concept that really hasn't been replicated with any other heal in the game ever, at least to my knowledge. Unlike Retail, Lifebloom can be casted on many players at once. It heals each second for 7 seconds until it blooms, at which point it heals for roughly the total amounts of healing that the hot did. It can also be stacked 3 times and then be refreshed before it runs out. The healing from the bloom will not increase from more applications, however. Lifebloom has a surprisingly strong healing power coefficient. In total, the 7 ticks will do 0.92 times of your total healing power as a bonus healing, and the bloom itself has an impressive 1.74 coefficient. This in combination with a modest mana cost gives it a high mana efficiency of 19.6 in total, or almost 22 if you are rolling it. And rolling Lifebloom means that you keep 3 stacks active on 1 or more targets, and then just refresh the hot before it blooms. Now meanwhile the hot has strong single target healing, it is also very limiting to your rotation, at least if you attempt to roll it. The short duration of 7 seconds means that a lot of your GCDs will have to be spent refreshing Lifebloom. Keeping 2 stacks of free applications active on 2 tanks throughout the fight will require you to cast nothing but Lifeblood at least 40% of the time. And should you for some reason fail to refresh a stack, you will have to pay quite a bit both in terms of healing per mana and healing per second. When it comes to dungeon healing, it will likely be a bad idea to keep a stack rolling, mainly because of how much it locks your rotation. A situation where you have to choose between refreshing the tank's stack or heal a DPS might be rather common. Not refreshing the stack will mean a big mana cost and a big HPS loss, and not healing the DPS could lead to the DPS dying. And each time you sit down to have a drink, you'll have to restart the stack. When it comes to dungeons, it seems, at least in theory, the best way to use the spell is by utilizing the bloom. Combining a max rank rejuvenation and a Lifebloom on the tank, and then combining a lower rank rejuvenation and a possible Lifebloom on the damage dealers. In raids, heavy sustained damage to a handful of players is the ideal situation for keeping a few stacks rolling. In the end, it's a very unique and interesting HOT. Learning to use it efficiently might require some practice, and making a mistake with it seems punishing. But it is also very efficient, both in terms of healing per second and healing per mana. But anyway, with Lifebloom covered, it's time to move on to the final kind of healing over time spell. Regruff has had a few reworked ranks from vanilla with lowered mana cost, and it is actually pretty much equal to Healing Touch for a couple of rank, at least when cast in Tree of Life. So Deep Restoration Druids shouldn't feel bad for throwing in a few casts of Regruffs here and there. Should you decide to use it as a parse heal, the balanced Resto build is probably the way to go. If you use it in Tree of Life, where you not only get the 50% extra crits, but also the 20% increased bonus healing to HOTS and the 20% reduced mana cost, it becomes more viable. Meanwhile, the balanced Resto Druid greatly increases the casting speed of the spell. The Tree of Life build actually gives it a slightly higher potential HPS, but when it comes to parsing as a healer, at least when you're overgeared for a fight, casting speed is almost everything. Regruff will likely be used more in TBC than it was in Classic, as Deep Resto Druids might utilize it instead of Healing Touch. But it is still a situational heal that you won't use in most cases. It is fast and the HOT is pretty strong, but it is also expensive. But anyway, with Regruff covered, it's time to move on to the direct healing. This spell might actually be the most buff healing spell when comparing TBC to vanilla, at least for druids. Meanwhile, Rejuvenation gets a 20% bigger coefficient in TBC, as well as a 20% reduced mana cost. Healing Touch still has a 19% reduction to its mana cost, as well as a new additional 20% to its coefficient. Now, supposing Blizzard is wording this correctly, the difference between Empowered Rejuvenation and Empowered Touch is that the Rejuvenation one increases the coefficient by 20%, meanwhile the Touch one adds another 20% to the coefficient. This basically means that you get 0.8 times 1.2 for Rejuvenation, but 1.0 plus 0.2 for Healing Touch. Starting at rank 5, Healing Touch gets 120% of your healing power as bonus healing. On top of that, this build also gives the Druid access to Dream States, which further increases your mana rejuvenation. But the Druid can also choose to pick Improved Fairy Fire in this build. As you probably remember, Tree of Life heavily limits which spells you can cast, and one of the spells it prevents you from using is Fairy Fire. Not only can Healing Touch Druids cast a spell, but they also get access to the heavily improved version. However, this is of course rather useless should you bring a balanced Druid to the raid as well. On top of that, Healing Touch Druids also have the option to remove Curse, something a Tree of Life Druid will have to pay quite a lot of mana to do. As a small side note, you also get quite a lot of talents to increase your draft DPS in this build. The big limitation to Healing Touch is the rather long cast time. I talked earlier about how healers in TBC will have to care for more players on average, which should mean a smaller risk of getting sniped. In vanilla, the big problem with Healing Touch was that you either had to use rank 3, which was fast but a bit weak, or rank 4, which was stronger but a bit slow. Also, the 1.2 times your healing power coefficient won't appear until rank 5. Rank 4 has 1.05, which is also really good. However, haste rating might help Druid counter the long cast time, although other healers might get haste as well. However, already at rank 4 you should be looking at a HPS close to 900, with an average of 2140 healing per cast for only 150 mana. Although it falls behind Rejuvenation in terms of healing per mana, it also, like mentioned, gives you access to one more mana regeneration talent. And there is of course nothing keeping you from using both Lifebloom and Rejuvenation when not using Tree of Life. When you progress through the phases in TBC, healing touches higher coefficient also means that it will scale better with gear than Rejuvenation would, of course depending on the rank. If there is a major problem with this build, it would be the either fast but weak or strong but long situation. But considering the changes being made come TBC, it isn't obvious that it would be such a big issue in practice. Also, as a side note, the Idol of Life from Vicidius has been changed to increase the healing of Healing Touch by 100 instead of reducing the cast time. Wuxulei's Charm of Nature has also been changed to increase your haste rating by 70 and reduce the mana cost of all your spells by 5%. Finally, you could make the case that if you are repeatedly getting sniped as a Healing Touch Druid, it might not be the case that the cast time is too long, but rather that you had too many healers in the first place. Moving on, we're going to take a look at the remaining two healing spells, Tranquility and Swiftmend, and we're gonna go with the latter first. Swiftmend, as you probably know, consumes either Rejuvenation or Regruff from a target and heals for either 4 ticks of Rejuvenation or 6 ticks of Regruff. The value depends on the strength of the hot, meaning the rank and the caster's healing power. You can Swiftmend another druid's hot as well. If there are 2 hots on the target, I honestly don't know which one Swiftmend will consume. This spell gives the druid access to direct healing, something that a Tree of Life druid lacks, and that is also how it should be viewed. Meanwhile, a hot druid mainly uses hots. They actually have some really quick heals on targets expected to take damage. Even if a tank dies in 2 seconds, a Lifebloom will still have healed for 2 ticks, at least if it's already active on the targets. And if Rejuvenation or Regruff is active on the targets and the druids act fast, there might be a Swiftmend as well during this time window. Swiftmend is however an occasional heal that should be used only when needed, partly to save the cooldown to have it available when you really need it, and partly because it falls short on the healing efficiency. Despite being iconic to the druid class, Tranquility is not really utilized. But it's also really good. Depending on the rank, it heals your entire party for a total of 14,000 healing at rank 1, all the way up to 40,000 at rank 5, and this is done over 10 seconds. The mana cost gives it a mana efficiency ranging from 34 to 30 healing per mana. If your entire party is dropping low, press your Tranquility. It can also be combined with Barkskin to prevent you from receiving pushback while channeling, and thus guarantee you get the full cast off. In a very niche situation, I think that this could be absolutely golden. If you run into a situation where the healing seems particularly demanding, remember that Tranquility might be an option. And so, those were all Restoration Druid healing spells in the Burning Crusade. There will very likely be a big shift in the meta for Restoration Druids in TBC compared to Classic, moving away from Healing Touch to Rejuvenation and Lifebloom. Partly because world buffs won't be a thing and thus can't be pushed off, partly because it seems to be the strongest healing a druid can provide, and finally because hots don't push each other off anymore. But at the same time, it might be a good idea to consider the balanced Resto build as well. If your raid doesn't have a boomkin, it would be very worth grabbing the improved Fairy Fire in the balanced tree. Also, a deep Resto Druid can't cast Fairy Fire anyway, so it would still be nice, regardless. But anyway, this was a theoretical approach to the Restoration Druid in the Burning Crusade. More videos are bound to come as TBC approaches and launches, so make sure to subscribe not to miss out on that. And also like. Feel free to join my Discord Cloudy Days, where you can see what I'm currently working on, make suggestions and ask questions. Should you feel like giving a little something, then there is a link to my PayPal in the description. But this was all I had for now. I'll be back soon with another video, and until then, see ya!